In 1957, American physicist Hugh Everett III proposed the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. See, a central idea in quantum mechanics is that a single particle can exist in multiple places at once. However, when you try to detect or measure a particle, you only see it in a single location. Everett theorized that the reason the observer can't see the other locations was that the observer himself has split into a number of observers, each seeing a definitive result of the measurement. Essentially, the particle exists across multiple states, and whenever it's observed, the observer's reality splits off into a separate one to view that particle. Over the decades, this theory has been developed into the idea of the multiverse, with every decision since the beginning of time causing the universe to split into an infinite number of other universes. A fascinating idea that presents many scientific and philosophical questions. But I don't know anything about that, so let's talk about superheroes. Hollywood is obsessed with the multiverse right now, and for good reason. It wins Oscars and is a huge hit at the box office. Most of the time. For a while, the Marvel Cinematic Universe's appeal came from its interconnected storyline, and with Avengers Endgame concluding the decade-long Infinity Saga, they needed a brand new canvas to play with. With the multiverse and time travel, filmmakers can tie their movies to the superhero films of old, allowing some of our favourite characters to return for more adventures. But with any success comes a backlash. Some say it robs these stories of dramatic weight since an infinite number of our favourite characters could be out there, and some are just too confused by the concept and unable to engage with the stories as a result. But with the success of Deadpool and Wolverine and the MCU being in the middle of its multiverse saga, this trend isn't going anywhere, so let's look at the good and the bad. Since my recent video essay on Wolverine did so well, thank you all very much for that by the way, I thought it would be fun to rank all the character returns enabled by the multiverse. And not just in the MCU, I'm looking at both the Sony universe and The Flash as well, but there will be some ground rules. 1. The character must originate from a pre-existing film or film series and have returned through the narrative device of the multiverse. Deadpool doesn't count here because that film is a sequel set in the old continuity as opposed to Wolverine who was grabbed from another universe. 2. This video will focus solely on cinematic cameos and appearances. I'm an outsider to the Arrowverse, which arguably started this trend, but since I'm not qualified to discuss all that stuff, I'm going to stick with what I know. And 3, I'm only going to rank live-action films, so don't expect to see Spectacular Spider-Man's return in Across the Spider-Verse or DCEU Batman's cameo in Crisis on Infinite Earths. Without further ado, let's jump into the hot mess that is the multiverse. Number 11, the Chrono Ball scene from The Flash. Poor Flash. Years of development hell, a revolving door of directors, and a literal criminal in the lead? This movie was dead on arrival. Being both a loose finale to the DCEU and a multiverse-hopping adventure, we knew there'd be cameos. What we didn't know is that these cameos would take the form of ghoulish abominations that haunt my nightmares to this day. The CGI has been criticised to death at this point, and for what it's worth, the environment itself is nicely designed and there's clearly an effort to make something visually interesting. The problem is the characters themselves, which just don't look good. If they'd utilised archive footage or just kept them in shadow, it wouldn't be so bad. But having scary Christopher Reeve get right up to camera looking like he's been through too many filters on Remini just left me feeling empty and a little uncomfortable. The Flash was released around the time of the actors' strikes where discussions surrounding AI and the protection of actors' likenesses were at the forefront. The Chrono Ball scene was frequently cited and there's no denying the icky feeling it provokes. Apart from Nicolas Cage and Helen Slater, all the actors depicted in this scene passed away years ago, and seeing them brought back for the sake of uncanny fan service leaves a sour taste in the mouth. George Reeves' appearance feels especially tasteless after reading up on his mental health struggles connected with the role and the nature of his death. There's an ethical debate to be had over the posthumous use of an actor's likeness, but when Reeves was seemingly so open about his negative experience in Hollywood, this just shouldn't have happened. To add further insult to injury, the film was released on the anniversary of Reeves' death. Even the living actors make no impression. Seeing Nicolas Cage finally don the cape and fight the giant spider from Superman Lives sounds exciting, but it doesn't even look like he turned up to set. He apparently did, but he's had so much CGI thrown over him that any humanity in his performance is completely lost. And that's the main issue with this scene, it's lifeless. It's just a bunch of plastic faces staring at a big ball of timey-wimey stuff. There's no soul to it, just ugly, gimmicky fan service. It's the very thing detractors to the multiverse are worried about, and is definitely the worst example of this trend. Number 10. Vulture in Morbius. I genuinely forgot this scene existed until I started writing, which tells you everything you need to know. 2022's Morbius gave us some incredible memes, a charismatic performance from Matt Smith, but that's about it. It's a nothing film. People had to literally make up things that were in it to make it funny. And this post-credit scene is one of the most confusing and half-hearted pieces of sequel bait since that evil dragon at the end of Aragon. Anyone else remember that? Just me? It was clearly a last-minute addition to capitalise on the hype surrounding No Way Home, and doesn't even have the decency to follow the rules of that film. That spell worked by bringing people who knew Spider-Man's identity to Earth 616, so why would it transport 616 Vulture to the Sony universe? Across the Spider-Verse almost fixes this by showing that a lot of villains got displaced from their universe after the fight at Kingpin's Collider, but that was clearly not the intention behind Morbius. The conversation is really clunky too. It's just Vulture talking about someone Morbius has never met and saying, hey, let's team up, and I'm not even paraphrasing.
I'm still figuring this place out, but I think a bunch of guys like us should team up. Could do some good.
The performances are flat, the dialogue is out of a cartoon, and given Morbius bombed twice, this scene is definitely going nowhere. It just comes across as desperate and leaves the viewer either confused or rolling their eyes. A little better than the Chrono Ball scene, but otherwise boring and unimaginative. Number 9. George Clooney as Batman in The Flash. The Flash is a bizarre mess of a film and ends on a similarly confusing note. When Barry Allen resets the timeline, he returns to a successful court hearing and a quick visit from Bruce Wayne, just not his Bruce Wayne.
Who the f*** is this?
Yep, the universe has returned to normal, but now with George Clooney as Batman. Honestly, it's pretty funny. I'd heard rumours that Clooney would appear, and given the pretty grounded world of the Nolan and Reeves films, he's kinda the only Batman that could appear. As embarrassed as he clearly is by his one go at the part in 1997, seeing Clooney back in the role is a fun surprise, but not as the last scene of the movie. As the credits rolled, I was just scratching my head. I assumed the timeline reset was to create a clean slate for the DCU, but now we had Clooney as our new Batman? Surely not. James Gunn later confirmed he wouldn't be moving forward with George Clooney in the role, suggesting this cameo was added to end the film on a gag rather than an empty promise like Henry Cavill's appearance in Black Adam. But unless they follow the news, your average audience member won't know that. They might genuinely leave the theatre thinking they pulled a 14th Doctor and brought in an old Batman to lead the new universe. If Clooney was going to appear, why not somewhere else in the film? Maybe even as one of the few living people in that Chrono Ball scene. This ending is seemingly the result of the poor management of DC films at that time, since they went through 3 different regimes while The Flash was in production. 3 different endings were considered, with one scene in which Michael Keaton greeted Barry even being shot, but with the planned reboot, this scene was shot instead. Clooney's appearance seemed to be there to avoid promising sequels that weren't going to happen like the other endings would have done, but I was really confused when I first watched it. I honestly thought there must be an extra scene where Barry changes the timeline again so he's not stuck with bat nipples here. Personally, I think this ending might have worked better if we just didn't see who stepped out the car. In fact, that was the ending screened to fans early on to preserve the surprise cameo, and I think it's more effective. Hold on Barry as Bruce approaches. We don't know what he's seeing, but his face changes from confusion to acceptance, knowing a better world has replaced the one he failed to save. It's ambiguous and allows for some wiggle room when the new Batman is officially announced. As for the scene we got, it does make me laugh, so it's at least better than the previous 2, but as an ending to the film, it's a bit muddled. Number 8. The villains in Deadpool and Wolverine. Deadpool and Wolverine is a love letter to the Fox Marvel films, and so naturally features many returning characters. Using the Void from Loki as a dumping ground for heroes and villains from bygone franchises gives the movie some more conflict amongst the quips and fourth wall breaks. Cassandra Nova's army is a who's who of villains from X-Men movies, The Punisher, and even Bullseye from Daredevil. It's fun to spot the different characters as you're watching the film, but they're ultimately just guys for Logan and Wade to fight, with only Tyler Mane and Aaron Stanford reprising their roles. Vinnie Jones was offered to return as Juggernaut, but he couldn't reach a suitable deal to make the costume more manageable. He's probably doing okay starring in lackluster Guy Ritchie shows and complaining about immigration. No, seriously, that's what he does now. Seeing Pyro as a disheveled henchman is a lot of fun, and having Sabretooth back with his original design was cool, but otherwise they're just cannon fodder, and since many of them didn't even get big roles the last time we saw them, it's hard to be that excited that they're all back. Hell, Sabretooth is killed as soon as he shows up, like even the film doesn't give a shit about any of them, which is actually quite funny. There's nothing wrong with the villains here, there's just not much to talk about. I placed them higher than Clooney's Batman because at least I wasn't confused about the future of the series after seeing another Psylocke. If Deadpool and Wolverine is a send-off to the legacy Marvel films, it's nice to have some of the old villains back, but otherwise, no one stands out. Number 7. The Illuminati in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Sam Raimi's Doctor Strange sequel seems to divide people, and I've even heard Multiverse of Midness being bandied around. But personally, it's one of my favourite post-Endgame films. Raimi went all out with the crazy imagery and transitions, really living up to the madness in its title. The final act is one of the most metal things I've ever seen in the MCU, and I love it. How can you hate a movie with a zombie wizard wearing a cloak made of evil spirits? And while Raimi's trippy, verging on horror approach is a great fit for Doctor Strange, the film is at its weakest for me when it starts playing into the whole multiverse fanservice stuff, with the Illuminati sequence being the biggest offender of this. Earth 838 is an interesting setting, with eco-friendly architecture and more comic booky elements, but the Illuminati meeting feels very choppy, with a lot of ADR and some actors obviously not being together to film it. Even Patrick Stewart's return feels a bit off, since there's clearly a disconnect between him and the rest of the scene. But this is probably just the reality of COVID-era filmmaking, where a lot of material must be recorded remotely and green screen becomes more of a necessity. All the characters look great. Lashana Lynch as Captain Marvel is cool, Xavier is sporting his animated series suit and hover chair, and Hayley Atwell just owns the Captain Carter look. I have no idea who Black Bolt is since I never watched Inhumans, but whatever, nice that he's there. John Krasinski fulfills our fancast dreams by finally playing Reed Richards, and as often happens when you give fans exactly what they want, all they did was complain. Yes, the CGI body is very noticeable, and there's no reason this had to be John and not Loan Griffith, who I'm sure would have done it, but for what it is, it's a nice gesture. The sequence is essentially an exposition dump, explaining what happened to the 838 Strange and what an incursion is, and if any characters were going to explain that, how about some we already know? It's a clunky setup to an admittedly cool fight scene. I just love the audacity to bring in these big stars just to have Wanda kill them in the most brutal ways you can get away with in a 12A. There were a lot of gasps and nervous laughing in the cinema, and it's surprisingly gruesome for an MCU film, especially Black Bolt's death, which was apparently Sam Raimi's idea. Honestly, Chad move. On a character level, the scene is lacking, since there isn't any room to develop the Illuminati members before they're all killed. But I like that Xavier still gives Strange the benefit of the doubt, showing he isn't as stubborn as the rest of the group. He even echoes his own words from Days of Future Past, which is a nice touch. The whole sequence feels like a direct response to the success of recent films, but in a cheap way, and the film would be more cohesive without it. Multiverse of Madness doesn't get enough credit for telling a multiverse story that's still character-driven, with Strange and Wanda being the focus, and this scene being the only time it falls into the traps of such stories. But the action, shock value, and overall insanity of it has always appealed to me. It's such a weird mix of fan service, violence, and some genuinely funny lines that it's hard not to find something to enjoy. Number 6, Beast in the Marvels. The Marvels was just okay. I appreciated the lighter tone and colourful visuals, I like Captain Marvel, and Kamala Khan is still the most lovable fangirl on the planet. But being the third Marvel movie that year, and its focus on female characters sadly made it a target for both detractors to the MCU and culture war outlets. But in the sea of all the Marvel fatigue and go woke, go broke crap online, I didn't hear anything about this post-credit scene. I knew nothing about the Beast cameo, making this a nice surprise to end the film on. The scene itself nicely builds anticipation as we gradually figure out where Monica is, and Teyonah Parris really sells the confusing emotions from seeing her mother alive and well. Kelsey Grammer's voice is delightful to hear again, and seeing him as a more comic booky Beast is awesome. The CGI is a bit cartoony, but I'm sure when he enters the MCU proper, the design will be refined with performance capture to bring more of Grammer's likeness to the character. Remember how weird Thanos looked before Infinity War? I have no idea what the scene is setting up other than establishing another X-Men universe, but my genuine shock seeing this for the first time is so rare in an age where the whole film can be spoiled by a TikTok. To walk into a film and not know a single thing about its ending was special, and it's a decent scene to boot, which earns it the 7th spot on this list. Number 5, Keaton Batman, The Flash. In the sea of controversy surrounding The Flash, the one thing keeping me interested was the return of Michael Keaton. I did a podcast with a friend when his casting was originally announced, and we were both so intrigued as to how he would fit into this movie that seemed destined to never come out. Back then, the whole idea of an actor returning to play the same character but from another universe was brand new, at least in the mainstream, but by the time The Flash was released, it was already a bit played out. However messy this film is, I think we can all agree that Michael Keaton is something of a highlight. The movie adapts elements of the Flashpoint storyline, in which Barry Allen teams up with an alternate Thomas Wayne who became Batman in this timeline after Bruce's death. So when bringing this storyline to the big screen, I see the logic of using a Batman the audience already knows. Seemingly ignoring the Joel Schumacher films, this Batman has retired after succeeding in his one-man war on crime, with Gotham now being one of the safest cities in the world. Director Andy Muschietti confirmed that he intended Bruce to have retired after crossing the line and killing a man, but I prefer this more triumphant yet low-key end to Batman's career. He hung up the cape and cowl because Gotham no longer needed him. He's done what he always wanted to do. He's even studying time travel, presumably after being inspired by Eric Stoltz as Marty McFly, and I like the scene of him explaining different timelines with spaghetti. It's a fun scene and shows a bit more of that eccentric side to Bruce we get hints of in the Burton films. Michael Keaton's performance is a little mixed. I can never tell how invested he is in the material, and based on recent comments, I think this was just another job to him. Strangely, it's the moments when he's out of the costume where Keaton really shines. He nails the sarcasm and he brings that same awkwardness of the Tim Burton version. It's when he's in the bat suit that it starts feeling artificial. I mean, the suit's great, keeping the feel of the original look while updating it in other respects, but something about Keaton in that mask just doesn't look right. The fight scenes are fun, I love hearing the Danny Elfman theme again, but by the end, it just doesn't feel earned. Looking at the behind the scenes, it's obvious so much care went into recreating the look and feel of Keaton's Batman with some incredible production design and costuming, but little thought seemed to go into telling a story that justified bringing him back. His arc of finding himself again feels underdeveloped, and I'm never 100% sure this is even the same character from those original films. The Flash has so much on its plate already, and bringing in another Batman was always going to be difficult, so Michael feels wasted on such a mediocre film. With how much effort went into these sets and costumes, I almost wish they just made a straight sequel to Batman Returns, or even that long-rumoured Batman Beyond movie. Michael Keaton is perfect for the grizzled mentor role, and there are signs of that in The Flash, but ultimately it doesn't amount to much. He makes it into the top 5 because of his more substantial role in the story, and the incredible work of the production team to resurrect the 1989 vision of The Dark Knight. Number 4, The Resistance in Deadpool and Wolverine. We've looked at the character returns I dislike, those I'm mixed on, but now we can finally talk about the ones I can safely say I enjoy. Director Sean Levy reinterpreted The Void as a purgatory for characters from dead franchises, with some of them having joined forces to fight for their right to exist. We have Jennifer Garner as Elektra, which I think was confirmed before the movie came out, but it's still great to see her again since I have a bit of a soft spot for 2003's Daredevil with all of its angsty, evanescent soundtrack glory. Daredevil, on the other hand, is dead, which Elektra is hilariously chill about. Wesley Snipes' Blade is back and looking damn good. Daphne Keane returns as Laura, and Channing Tatum finally gets to fulfill his lifelong dream to play Gambit. Channing's been waiting years for this, with his film being stuck in development hell, and that passion comes across in his performance. The accent, the costume, the presence, he's having the time of his life here and gets some of the biggest laughs of the film. This will probably take away any credibility I have as a Marvel fan, but I have never seen the Blade movies. But even I understand the weight of Wesley Snipes returning to this role. He gets to be a badass and even surpasses Hugh Jackman's record for the longest career as a Marvel character. I'm looking forward to seeing Mahershala Ali's take on the role, but it's great to see Snipes come back one last time. Daphne Keane is an incredible young talent, and it's sweet that she got to grow up and has continued fighting for what's right. Although it's a little sad she got pruned after losing her dad. I like that she's the one to convince Wolverine to join the fight, explaining that although he isn't the same hero she knew, neither was her father until he needed to be. It's one of the most emotional scenes in the film and a great way to honor Logan. Also, seeing her in the sunglasses again was awesome. And no, I didn't forget about Johnny Storm, who I'm including here since he's referenced as being part of the Resistance. As soon as the Avengers theme started, I knew where this was going, since like a lot of people, I saw this tweet years ago. But the scene is still hilarious, and there'll be plenty of people who had no idea Chris Evans had come back and not as Steve Rogers. But even taking away the hilarity of seeing him as the Human Torch again, Chris gives a genuinely great performance. I looked back at a few scenes from the Fantastic Four movies, and his portrayal 17 years later hasn't missed a beat. The accent, the bravado, and even the suit are all completely consistent with those films, so Chris clearly did his homework. His grisly death was such a shock, and the payoff after the credits had my audience in stitches. It's a perfectly executed cameo, and a funny way to bring Chris back without detracting from his emotional send-off in Endgame. Take notes, Dr. Doom. The scenes with the Resistance are awesome and hilarious, but these reprisals are meaningful on a deeper level. Daredevil and its spin-off were reviled by fans, Blade and Fantastic Four are about to get rebooted, and in the case of Daphne Keane and Channing Tatum, their films were a casualty of the Disney-Fox merger. Marvel under 20th Century Fox was rocky, inconsistent, and often embarrassing, but produced some excellent films, and the MCU wouldn't exist without them. They all deserved a better fate than what they got. I know Blade is New Line Cinema, but you get the point. Deadpool and Wolverine gives them that ending, and it's incredibly moving. The film does poke fun at this bygone era, but it's clearly a loving tribute, and it's this meta-narrative that makes The Resistance one of the best examples of the multiverse in recent memory. Number 3, Hugh Jackman as Wolverine in Deadpool and Wolverine. I've already talked about this in another video, so definitely check that out if you want to hear more. But the Cliff Notes version, Logan gave the character a great send-off, so there was trepidation from both fans and filmmakers about bringing Wolverine back. But instead of this being an obstacle to overcome, the writers used this trepidation for both drama and comedy. Deadpool can't get his Wolverine back, so he half-heartedly plucks another from the multiverse, and the whole film is about this Wolverine having to live up to the memory of the original, which is where Hugh Jackman shines. Despite being in a silly, universe-hopping comedy, he plays the character as seriously as ever, giving a heartfelt human performance as the perfect match to the wisecracking Deadpool. I think because Deadpool occupies such a weird place in the Marvel movie landscape, a lot of us were fine with Hugh returning in this context. Had this been an Avengers film, this might have felt cheap or in poor taste. But the meta-ness of the Deadpool series makes Wolverine's return a little easier to swallow. The film knows it can't be the emotionally driven drama that Logan was, so it just has fun with Hugh returning to the character. And for a movie that literally opens by desecrating his corpse, it's a surprisingly tasteful continuation of Wolverine's legacy. Would I like to see the character recast in the future? Absolutely. But if Hugh Jackman had to return, I'm glad this was the story they chose to tell. He really is the X-Man. Number 2, the villains in Spider-Man No Way Home. I distinctly remember how confusing it was when Jamie Foxx was reported to return as Electro in the third MCU Spider-Man movie. Remember, this was the most cursed of years, 2020. The multiverse saga was a distant dream, so I just assumed he'd be playing a new version of Electro exclusive to the MCU. But then Alfred Molina was rumoured to come back, and eventually revealed in an interview he probably wasn't meant to do, that the film would pick up right where Spider-Man 2 left off. They were really doing this. Cut to a few months later, and
Hello, Peter.
Was everywhere. With how saturated the multiverse trend has become, No Way Home doesn't get the credit it deserves for how it utilizes its legacy characters. Yes, there's plenty of fan service and memes, but it all services the story of the MCU's Peter Parker. The story of Spider-Man is one of responsibility, and this film explores that with Peter trying to get everything he wants through magic, but ultimately losing all of it to keep his world safe. The villains are destined to die in their respective universes, and being the person he is, Peter won't let that happen, feeling responsible for their mutations. The Green Goblin acts as an almost literal devil on his shoulder, taunting Peter to give in to his power and become like him. He fits beautifully into MCU Peter's story, and he's not even from his universe. Somehow the script manages to give all the villains something to do and justifies giving them all another chance. Some of them are just CGI, which is probably a result of COVID limitations, but amazingly, all the original actors came back. The Lizard's back, and I swear sounds more British than he did in 2012. And as someone who got into film discussion because of The Amazing Spider-Man, seeing him briefly reunite with Andrew Garfield's Peter was really sweet. Jamie Foxx basically reinvents his Electro from the ground up, but has a lot of fun with it and is genuinely threatening in places. I also like the reason why he looks different. It's a different universe, so he's drawing power from different energy. While the characters from the Mark Webb films are largely reworked, all of Octavius and the Goblin's dialogue feels ripped right from the script of those films, and it's not afraid to play into the cheesiness that the Raimi films mastered. But it's this story of second chances that makes this all work. Almost all these characters were either killed or left mutated, but because of a failed spell, Peter has the chance to change their fates, to rehabilitate them with the advanced technology of the MCU. There was some concern before the film came out that bringing back a villainous Doc Ock would ruin his redemption at the end of Spider-Man 2, and luckily the film doesn't do this. He's back to his villainous ways at the start, and in fairness he's cranky because he's been teleported to another universe, but Peter can fix the broken chip that led to him becoming a monster, and my god, Alfred Molina sells the hell out of that moment. He's fantastic here, giving a thrilling and heartfelt performance. I think there's an argument to be made that Doc Ock is the most cinematic Spider-Man villain, since his mechanical arms offer great opportunities for fight scenes. The train fight in Spider-Man 2 is still an incredible set piece, and the fight on the bridge in No Way Home was a great reintroduction to his character. But let's finally talk about Willem Dafoe as Norman Osborn. It was always perfect casting, and 20 years later he's as iconic as ever. He's excellent as both the regretful Norman and the maniacal darker half. The original Sam Raimi film presented Norman as a potential father figure for Peter, and the Goblin as a twisted mentor trying to bring him to the dark side. And this continues in No Way Home. We have Norman offering Peter a job at Oscorp, and the Goblin being disgusted that he doesn't use his powers to have everything he wants. The fact this isn't even his Peter and he still views him this way shows how serious he is about his binary winners and losers philosophy. Willem is also genuinely scary here. He only wears the mask once, and frankly, he doesn't need it. He's so expressive and goes all out for this victory lap performance. Does it completely make sense with the original films? No, it needed to retcon a few things, like Norman's cause of death being common knowledge despite Harry refusing to believe it until the end of Spider-Man 3. And there's a bit of a debate over whether Peter actually saved the villains or they just returned to branched timelines. It's a little clunky, but honestly, it's amazing how well this all fits together by the end. I like to think the spell simply resurrected those villains within the MCU and teleported those who hadn't died there by accident. This could explain Doc Ock's slightly altered costume and why their memories are so scrambled. Continuity aside, by weaving them all into MCU Peter's story and staying true to their roots while still updating them in places, the Sinister Five are an absolute blast to watch. Oh yeah, Tom Hardy's also in this. No Way Home is a celebration of all the Spider-Man films, so it makes sense to also connect with the Sony universe. It's a funny scene, and nicely sets up the symbiote being in the MCU, presumably to bond with Tom Holland's Peter in the future. Not much else to say about this, really. And finally, number 1. In my opinion, the best multiversal return for a superhero is still Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield in No Way Home. In the worst kept secret in movie history, the Spider-Man from the Raimi and Webb films returned to the big screen. Even if you knew about the leaks, the rumours, and Andrew Garfield's year-long werewolfing, nothing matched that thrill of seeing him jump through that portal. I saw the film a couple days after its premiere, and even then there was a little applause when Andrew ripped off his mask. Nearly 3 years later, seeing these two icons of my childhood on screen together still feels so surreal. Is the long silence after the reveal a bit awkward at home? Sure, but come on, you really had to be there for this one. But we all know how cool it was to see these three together. What really makes this the best example of this current trend? Fanservice is a phrase often thrown around as a pejorative. The idea seems to be that it's lazy, just putting a popular character on screen to make fans happy. And yeah, it can be lazy if the story does nothing to justify the character's presence. If you've waited years and sometimes decades to see this actor return to the role, that's a lot to live up to, and many films just don't go the extra mile to make it feel earned. No Way Home did, because despite the obvious green screens, some retcons, and the things film Twitter likes to complain about, all the fan service in this film services the story and characters. There's at least a half hour of non-multiverse stuff, and the other two Spider-Men don't even arrive until the final act. This is first and foremost Tom Holland Peter's story. It's his journey of sacrifice and in many ways his coming of age. Marvel Studios have had a bit of an issue with letting Spider-Man stand on their own, but Jon Watts' third Spider-Man adventure never forgets who the main character is. The ending recontextualizes all the time we've spent with Tom Holland's Peter as an extended origin story. He ends the film in the classic costume with no friends or family, just swinging into the night. When Peter finally meets his other selves, it's not the grandiose epic moment we all envisioned, because that's not the story they're telling. It's a wonderfully understated moment and a real heart-to-heart between the three of them. They connect over their respective losses and give Peter One the motivation and reassurance he needs to continue doing the right thing. The film kind of treats them like brothers, which was a genius move. There's a clear love in their eyes when they look at each other, and like in Spider-Verse, they finally feel like they belong somewhere. Yes, they have the conversations we've always wanted them to have, but I think the reason these scenes hit as hard as they do is because they just feel like people connecting. I also appreciate that while fans continue to debate who the best Spider-Man is, the film doesn't even bother engaging in this, and has the three of them on good terms throughout. I was always put off by fan posters I saw in the lead up to the film with Tobey Maguire front and centre, worried that the film would completely sideline Tom Holland in his own movie. My biggest concern was that either the other Peters would be main characters throughout, or would only show up in the final battle. What we got was the perfect middle ground. They're given just the right amount of screen time and never feel like they're detracting from Peter One's journey. It still feels like part of the wacky high school comedy tone that Jon Watts' trilogy established, especially in the scene in the lab. Tobey Maguire gives a very laid-back performance consistent with the original trilogy, while still feeling like he's grown since then. He seems to have come to terms with all he's lost, and has even been considering how he could cure Norman over the years. He's back with MJ, dressing like a cool youth pastor, and even gets his back fixed.
Yeah, that's good.
For me, Andrew Garfield is the standout here. We know from interviews that he finished Amazing Spider-Man 2 on a sour note, so seeing him back in the role with newfound energy and passion is so heartwarming. He nails the comedy, the emotional beats, and has amazing chemistry with the other two. The Amazing series ended quite abruptly, so like The Resistance in the Void, this movie gives Peter Free a new ending. He's been in a dark place since Gwen's death, and can finally heal through meeting his alternate selves, curing Dr. Connors, again, and saving Max Dillon. But most importantly, after failing to save Gwen Stacy and living with that pain for years, he saves MJ from the same fate. In essence, he saves a younger version of himself from the same pain he suffered, and can finally forgive himself. The tears in Garfield's eyes say it all, and his return was worth it for that moment alone. In 2019, the MCU almost lost Spider-Man, and it's clear that part of the motivation behind bringing all these characters back was to make No Way Home a celebration of the franchise. Jon Watts and the whole team managed to somehow make each previous film feel like part of one grand narrative, and it has more than earned the top spot on my list. Looking back at all these films has made me think long and hard about the multiverse. I think anyone calling it the death of cinema is being ridiculous. People said the same thing about cinematic universes in 2016. I also don't buy the claim that it lessens the stakes of the story by having multiple versions of a character, because that assumes that all dramatic weight comes from whether the character will die. The original versions of characters like Loki and Wolverine are still dead, and through their variants we can explore new sides to them and give them brand new character arcs. But yes, they can be lazy. And I do worry at times that after so much experimentation after the Infinity Saga wrapped up, the MCU seems to be going back to the familiar and safe characters. Robert Downey Jr. as Dr. Doom is a casting decision I'm mixed about. I'd rather the franchise was moving forward, and while it isn't the literal same character as Tony Stark, I think the legacy of Robert's Marvel filmography would be more secure without this big return. Time will tell how much patience audiences have with the multiverse, but for all the talk of fatigue and frustration with the idea, Marvel's biggest successes after Endgame have all been in the multiverse. No Way Home and Deadpool and Wolverine both grossed $1 billion. Loki is a fan favourite series, and that's all time travel and universe hopping. And do I even need to mention Spider-Verse? People aren't tired of multiverse stories. They're tired of bad multiverse stories. Part of the reason I made this video was to look at the flaws of multiverse crossovers and their strengths. These films aren't going anywhere anytime soon, so let's see how we can make them the best they can be. Personally, I think these films work best when the stories are character-driven and the multiverse elements serve a thematic purpose. That doesn't mean throw out all the cameos and fanservice, have as much as you like, so long as it's organically woven into the narrative. Critics have to stop thinking of audiences as clapping seals and acknowledge that people just enjoy seeing characters come back, but even more so if it's part of an engaging story. We've seen with Everything Everywhere All at Once and the incredible Spider-Verse films that the multiverse still has dramatic potential and can still lead to successful films. Anything can work, you just have to make it work. So instead of just dismissing the next crossover out of hand, constructively explain what you want to see from it. The multiverse is full of possibilities, so let's jump in and explore them all.